Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris, and I am genuinely thrilled about today's subject because it sits right at the intersection of artificial intelligence and medicine, and it might be the most consequential AI story that almost nobody outside the biotech world is tracking closely right now.
So let's frame it carefully for everyone listening, because when most people hear AI news these days, they picture chatbots and coding assistants, not actual pills and injections that could genuinely end up inside a real human patient someday soon.
Exactly, and this week handed us two milestones that historians of this field will almost certainly circle later. Insilico Medicine formally began a phase 3 trial for an AI-discovered drug, and Isomorphic Labs is moving its own AI-designed molecules into people.
Let's take those one at a time because the specific details matter enormously here, and I want to start with Isomorphic Labs, since that particular name carries an unusual amount of weight given exactly where it originally came from.
Isomorphic is the drug discovery company that Alphabet spun out of Google DeepMind back in 2021, and it is run by Demis Hassabis, the very same person who leads DeepMind and who shared a Nobel Prize for foundational protein structure work.
Right, so this is the AlphaFold lineage. And I want to make sure our listeners really appreciate just how enormous a deal AlphaFold was when it first cracked the protein folding problem that had stubbornly stumped biologists for roughly 50 years.
Let me walk through that whole evolution because it is genuinely the foundation of everything we are discussing today. AlphaFold 2 predicted the three-dimensional shape of proteins directly from their amino acid sequence, which stood as a truly historic scientific achievement.
And shape matters so much because a protein structure basically determines what it actually does inside your body. So if you can reliably predict that structure, you can start reasoning about how a potential drug molecule might grab onto it.
Precisely. And then AlphaFold 3, co-developed with Google DeepMind and unveiled back in 2024, went considerably further by predicting how proteins interact with DNA, with RNA, and with the small molecules that eventually go on to become actual medicines.
So we effectively went from predicting a single protein's shape to predicting the interactions between many different molecules, which is obviously a great deal closer to the genuinely messy reality of how drugs behave inside real living cells.
And Isomorphic then layered its own proprietary system on top of that, called the Isomorphic Labs Drug Design Engine, which adds capabilities like binding affinity estimation, cryptic pocket identification, and antibody modeling to that already powerful structural prediction foundation underneath it.
Okay, you have to translate cryptic pockets for me, because that particular phrase honestly sounds like something out of an espionage thriller rather than a serious description of the cutting-edge pharmaceutical chemistry that people are quietly betting billions of dollars on.
Happily, a cryptic pocket is a hidden groove on a protein that only appears when the protein flexes and moves. And if your AI can reliably spot one, you can design a drug to exploit a target that previously looked completely undruggable.
That is honestly a beautiful example of AI finding something that human researchers would genuinely struggle to see on their own. And it connects directly to the specific drug candidate that Isomorphic just pushed toward the clinic earlier this year.
It absolutely does. And right around January 28th of 2026, the FDA cleared their candidate, ISM 8969, for human trials, which made it one of the very first AI-designed drugs anywhere to reach that important regulatory threshold.
And here's the part that genuinely gave me chills when I first read about it, because the AI reportedly flagged a specific molecular interaction that the human researchers on the team simply had not been prioritizing on their own beforehand.
That is the absolute dream scenario for this entire technology, the non-obvious path straight through overwhelming biological complexity. And Isomorphic is deliberately aiming its very first clinical programs at oncology rather than thinly spreading itself across many different disease areas at once.
Why oncology first, though? Because cancer is famously one of the single hardest problems in all of medicine. So on the surface, it honestly seems like a strange and risky place to plant your flag on your very first attempt.
It does sound counterintuitive, but cancer indications often have faster regulatory pathways and much clearer measurable endpoints. So you can actually read out whether a tumor shrank far more quickly than you could track a slow chronic disease over many years.
Let's talk seriously about the money, too, because absolutely none of this happens on a shoestring budget, and the overall funding picture tells you just how seriously the established pharmaceutical giants are now taking these ambitious AI-native newcomers.
Absolutely. Isomorphic raised $600 million led by Thrive Capital in early 2025. And its partnerships with the drug giants Eli Lilly and Novartis are reported to total roughly $3 billion in potential overall deal value.
And those partnerships are not merely a pile of cash, they're also powerful validation. Because Lilly and Novartis both possess the deep clinical infrastructure to actually run enormous trials that a standalone AI startup could never realistically manage entirely on its own.
Which brings us quite neatly over to the second major milestone, Insilico Medicine. Because if Isomorphic is just now entering the clinic, then Insilico is already several meaningful steps further down the long road toward a potential eventual approval.
This is the Phase 3 news from earlier this very month, and I honestly think it might be the single most important data point in the entire AI drug discovery story so far, so please carefully unpack the whole thing for us.
On July 7th of 2026, Insilico announced that it started a Phase 3 trial for a drug called rentosertib, which targets idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, a genuinely brutal and progressive scarring of the lungs with very high unmet need.
And what exactly makes this particular molecule so special, as opposed to the many hundreds of other experimental drugs that are quietly moving through pipelines at basically any given moment across the sprawling global pharmaceutical industry right now?
What makes it genuinely special is that both the target and the molecule itself came directly from artificial intelligence. So the AI first identified which biological switch to hit and then designed the actual chemical compound to precisely hit it.
So this is emphatically not AI merely assisting a human chemist somewhere at the margins. This is AI driving the two most fundamental creative decisions in the entire process, target selection and molecule design, essentially end to end.
Right, and it already cleared a peer-reviewed Phase 2A study that was published in Nature Medicine, where the 60 milligram once-daily arm improved lung function by roughly 98 milliliters, while the placebo patients over the same period actually declined.
Now I want to deliberately put on my skeptic hat for a moment, because 98 milliliters sounds genuinely encouraging. But that was still a relatively small 12-week study, and Phase 3 is honestly a completely different and far more demanding beast.
You are absolutely right to push hard there, and honestly, that very skepticism is the single most important theme running through this whole episode, because promising early signals do not always survive first contact with larger, longer, and much tougher trials.
So let's zoom all the way out to the big picture now, because these two individual companies are really just the visible tip of a far larger and frankly staggering wave of investment that has quietly built up over several years.
The overall numbers are honestly staggering because roughly $60 billion has flowed into AI drug discovery since 2019, and somewhere around 175 to 200 AI-originated drug programs have already entered human clinical trials.
That is a genuinely enormous pipeline. So please break down where all of those many programs actually sit today, because there is a massive practical difference between an early safety study and a huge, expensive registrational trial sitting near approval.
As of January this year, the rough split was around 94 programs in Phase 1, 56 in Phase 2, and only about 15 sitting in Phase 3, with maybe 15 to 20 of them reaching pivotal late-stage trials this year.
And here's the genuinely uncomfortable fact that hangs quietly over this entire industry. Because despite all of that money and all of those hundreds of programs, not a single AI-designed drug has actually earned full FDA approval yet.
That is exactly why 2026 matters so enormously, because the Phase 3 readouts that are due by the very end of this year are the first genuinely hard evidence of whether this entire ambitious approach truly delivers real, working medicines.
It is basically the field's long-awaited final exam after years and years of very promising homework. And the graders here are large, expensive, ruthlessly rigorous human trials that frankly do not care at all how elegant your underlying algorithm happened to be.
And the specific choice of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis honestly raises the stakes even higher. Because that particular disease is a genuine graveyard where multiple well-resourced and well-designed drug programs from major pharmaceutical companies have quietly failed over the past couple of decades.
So please spell out both sides of that coin for me clearly, because it really sounds like rentosertib is now carrying an awful lot of heavy symbolic weight on behalf of an entire technological movement all at once here.
If it ultimately succeeds, it becomes powerful and very public proof that AI-discovered biology genuinely translates into real clinical benefit. And every skeptic who confidently called this whole thing a hype bubble suddenly has to seriously reconsider their entire position.
And if it instead fails, then what happens next? Because I imagine that a high-profile failure in such a deeply symbolic flagship program could cast a very long and genuinely chilling shadow over the funding and the optimism we just described.
If it fails, people will very fairly ask whether small, 12-week, early-stage improvements coming from AI-discovered molecules are actually reliable predictors of success in the large registration trials. And that hard question would rightly spook a great many nervous investors.
I also honestly think we should be candid that some of the eye-popping industry statistics deserve real caution, like the confident claims that AI cuts discovery timelines by 70% or dramatically slashes research costs across basically the entire board.
That is a completely fair challenge to raise because many of those impressive figures come directly from the companies and the vendors selling the technology, and they describe the early discovery stage, not the long and brutally expensive clinical stage.
Right, because discovering a promising molecule considerably faster does not actually help you very much in the end. If that molecule still fails in the clinic at roughly the same discouraging rate as every traditionally discovered drug that came before it.
Exactly. The real prize here is emphatically not just raw speed, it is a genuinely higher ultimate success rate. And that is precisely the specific claim that only these late-stage human trials can actually confirm or else completely demolish for good.
Let's also briefly touch on the regulators here because the FDA is very much not just sitting passively on the sidelines, while all of this genuinely remarkable transformation unfolds around them at such a rapid and accelerating pace lately.
Indeed, the agency reportedly launched a new initiative to speed up early-stage clinical trials, which some of the coverage has referred to as Operation Trailblazer, potentially trimming somewhere between 6 and 12 months off those crucial early development timelines.
That strongly signals regulators are actively trying to adapt their internal processes to a genuinely new kind of drug origin. Though I strongly suspect they will remain appropriately cautious about the actual safety and efficacy bar that every single drug must clear.
As they absolutely should remain, because a faster path into trials is only genuinely good news if the underlying evidence standard that protects real, vulnerable patients stays every single bit as rigorous and demanding as it has always reliably been before.
So let's bring this whole thing home for our listeners now, because behind all of the models and the money and the milestones, there are real people living with terrible diseases, quietly waiting to see whether any of this actually pays off.
That is honestly the part that moves me the most, because idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis and many aggressive cancers still carry enormous unmet medical need, and even one single AI-designed drug that truly works could genuinely change an enormous number of lives.
And whichever way these pivotal readouts ultimately land for us, we are clearly watching a genuine turning point, the precise moment the AI drug discovery field finally stops making grand promises and at last starts actually showing us its real report card.
Beautifully put, and my honest advice to every listener is to watch the Phase 3 data far more closely than any flashy product demo. Because in medicine, the slow, rigorous clinical evidence is ultimately the only thing that truly counts.
Before we finally wrap, give our listeners the one honest sentence you would most want them to remember about this entire pivotal moment in AI drug discovery, cutting cleanly through both the breathless hype and the reflexive, lazy cynicism.
I would say simply this. Artificial intelligence has genuinely earned a real seat at the drug design table now. But the medicine itself still has to pass exactly the same unforgiving human trials as everything else, with absolutely no shortcuts allowed.
That wraps up our conversation for today, and this is honestly a story that we will be following extremely closely all year long. That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.